This is Blueprints of Disruption, a podcast made for rabble-rousers, and I'm Jessa McLean. You're in for another installment of Tenant Power, a series that should really worry landlords, which is actually what our next guests aim to do.
Landlords really, their whole business model is based on inflicting violence on people, on tenants, which they are completely removed from. So they can force people out of their homes onto the street. They can force people to live in horrible conditions while they live in mansions, and they never have to deal with it. So I think with 2025, I know Toronto's a bit ahead of where we are in Ottawa, but we're going to show them that they can't get away with it anymore, that you can't inflict this kind of violence on people and expect to just wash your hands of it and live comfortably in your home. It's just not gonna, that era has passed.
That was Ethan Mitchell. He'll be joined by Seema, Shafei, and Shivangi Misra, all of the Neighbourhood Organizing Center in Ottawa. This piece perfectly complements last week's discussion with the bank block tenants, who praised the work this group is doing to activate the tenant class, as they say, door by door, building by building, and block by block. How would you describe your organization? I mean, we'll get into the nitty gritty, but like you have to come up with a little bio for your Insta. How can you describe yourself to the audience?
Yeah, I would say that the Neighborhood Organizing Center, or NOC, and I'm also a big fan of the acronym in part because we've knocked on so many doors over the last couple of years. It just seems appropriate at this point. But yeah, the brief description of it would be that we are a group of people who have come together to build capacity to support tenant organizing. So our focus is on being that kind of structure in our community where we can build familiarity, where we can develop knowledge of how tenants can fight and win, and where we can develop some structures too of community support and concretely work with tenants who want to get organized in their buildings or on their blocks to form a tenant committee or a tenant union. So we see ourselves kind of in that supporting role and building capacity, just because there have been so many struggles where tenants are faced with an eviction or with some serious maintenance issues or an above guideline rent increase. And it's not like in labor organizing where there's a very clear framework for how things like bargaining and unionization are supposed to work. A lot of the time, tenants are having to learn those lessons for the first time when they're faced with a critical issue. So our goal is to make sure that tenants don't have to learn the same thing every time, but that there's a group of people in the community who can be there in support of those tenants and help share some lessons that have been learned and support them in building their power in their buildings.
That really hits because we've talked to so many tenant unions that have begun when their backs are against the wall. And so they're having to do that learning process in a moment of crisis. It's traumatic getting an eviction notice, or exhausting having to go up against a landlord for a maintenance issue. So it's likely hit a peak in your frustration, and then you have to figure out how to organize yourself. So absolutely, it's like preventative medicine. And I can't tell you how excited I am to talk to you folks, because the audience will know we've really focused on tenant organizing and tenant unions here at Blueprints of Disruption because of the potential it holds to harness the power of the, quote unquote, working class. 30% of people are tenants in Canada. That is a huge number to leverage. It's also a huge power imbalance, which we've got 1 million episodes dedicated to that as well. So these folks are going to help us understand how they do what they do, what those support structures look like, and, update us on how it's going for tenants in the Ottawa area. Seema, is there anything you want to add to Ethan's description of the organization that kind of makes you unique?
Essentially, the Neighborhood Organizing Center came out of a bunch of mass work that was done, door knocking on people's buildings throughout Ottawa to ask people what it is that they saw as a really pressing issue in the city that they needed assistance with or that they wanted to organize around. And that was over the course of a year and a half.
We did door knock in the neighborhood, in the Centertown West neighborhood, and spoke to people. And we door knocked, we spoke to a bunch of people about their jobs, about just our everyday life, and what matters the most and what are the main issues that our community is facing. And overwhelmingly, it was housing. And then followed closely with the cost of living. It's not a surprise to anyone, but I think talking to more and more people, it strengthened that. And that led to the People's Assembly, which was an event where people came together and we spoke about what kind of neighborhood organizing has happened. It is in the history of Ottawa and what can be done. And from People's Assembly, as we were organizing the People's Assembly, some tenants on Bank Street had begun organizing a tenant committee to resist their mass eviction. And one of those folks organizing BBT was also one of the main organizers of the People's Assembly. So we were closely connected right from the beginning.
At that event, we spoke about some general analysis of the housing situation in Ottawa, as well as what we can do about it. And the kind of big takeaway from it, on the one hand, was the need to fight and to struggle, recognizing that what's often called the housing crisis is not a system that's not working the way it's intended to. The housing crisis is a system working exactly the way it's intended to, which is to say, exploiting working class people in order to enrich landlords and developers and big investors. So a big focus of the People's Assembly event last summer of 2023 was, how do we fight? And our next steps that we identified based on hearing from other tenant organizers in the city, for example, folks that had been involved in the Herongate struggle, as well as an eviction defense at Osgood Chambers, also in Ottawa in the Sandy Hill neighborhood. The big takeaway was that we need to get organized, not just at the city level or building organizations at a large scale or at the neighborhood or city level, but building by building and block by block, which also gelled with our initial assessment of the People's Assembly, where we had a good turnout at the event, but it wasn't necessarily the people who we really wanted to be there. We spoke to a number of tenants in preparation for that who were facing severe issues, whether maintenance or eviction or other kinds of abuse by their landlord. And even though we spoke to some of those people a number of times, many of them didn't show up at that event. So we kind of realized that we need something deeper and more structural if we want to actually support tenant organizing in a way which is impactful. Our goal as a group was to find tenants who had issues and support them in getting organized. And this is the group that evolved over the last year plus into the Neighbourhood Organizing Center as we gained more experience doing that and internally became more organized. And now we're at a point where we're going to reconvene the People's Assembly, but with these lessons in mind.
I absolutely love how you had to reevaluate. Like, you knew you had people in mind and you knew there was people who needed help. And, you know, even though I've heard great things about the People's Assembly, it wasn't enough, right? So rather than just beat your head against the wall, it was a pivot of sorts. But I would be curious to hear the lessons you're going to apply, because some of the people in the audience have organized town halls, I'm sure, or been to them. Maybe not like a People's Assembly with that spirit in mind, if you understand what I mean. I mean, most of the town halls I think a lot of us have experienced are usually just platforms for politicians or local leaders or somebody with an agenda, right? Somebody who wants to relay information, maybe just be accessible for questions. But this is different. This is a form of democracy a lot of people haven't experienced. I mean, maybe you did a great job the first time, but can you talk a little bit how you create an environment that you can rightfully call a People's Assembly, right? So that you're not talking to people, but you're gathering voices in an effective way.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm sure others will also want to speak to this, but I'll just start off. For us, the assessment is really that it's good and it's necessary to have something like a larger people's assembly or a larger forum, which brings together people from across different neighborhoods. But in order for that to be successful in the way that we want it to be successful, it has to be built on a foundation. And that foundation is immediate organizing in people's buildings with their neighbors and on people's blocks. Because what we're talking about really with tenant organizing is something that is genuinely, it has the potential to be transformative. And in order to get people organized to a point where we can push forward that kind of transformative politics, we need to have more than just a few conversations with them in a large group. We found while working with the bank block tenants, for example, how neighbors who see each other every day, who live side by side, and who share the same conditions and the same interests and the same struggles, in those groups, there's potential to have a much deeper form of discussion, of democracy, and also of engagement. So moving forward with organizing at the level of the People's Assembly, our goal is really to build up from immediate struggles in buildings and on blocks where neighbors can have that direct engagement with one another. And then from there, it can be built up to a larger level where people in different buildings representing their buildings can engage with one another. And that's our goal going forward.
Tenants union.
And if I could add to that, like what Ethan had said previously about, there being rules and regulations and legislation specifically around labor organizing, what that looks like, certain parameters that have to be met before the next step is completed. There isn't really that rule book in the same way for tenant organizing. In Ontario, the Residential Tenancies Act simply just says you have a right to organize and the landlord can't interfere with that organizing. But beyond that, it's really up to tenants themselves to be able to figure out what exactly needs to be taken, how to create power for themselves. And in that realm, there is a lot more creative potential because there's not limitations to tenant organizing in the same way that labor organizing is. So we are kind of at a really good ground for shaping how tenants build back their own power.
Union organizing can be so frustrating because you have to stay in these avenues of bureaucracy often that just, is not really effective to disruptive change, right? And when you're going up against landlords, and I imagine we've seen tenant unions, bring cockroaches down to the office buildings of the landlord. And, I imagine that just wouldn't be on the manual of union organizing of ways you could negotiate with your boss. The good news is also the threshold, that number threshold, although it's ideal to get as many people as possible in your building signed on, 5 good shit disturbers in a building telling the landlord, pushing back on the lack of notice or anything is better than nothing, and can get a lot done.
Right. Even in the labor organizing context, right? All this legislation, all the rules came out of a very specific history of labor unions becoming very real shit disturbers to the point that the government needed to pass legislation to be able to control it and saying, okay, we can't control this any longer just by putting people in prison because that's clearly not working anymore. We have to create this very bureaucratic rule book for labor unions to be able to still exist, but we still have control over them. And over time, as we've seen, government support a lot of the times. So we've seen this in, private companies having more and more power, places taking their factories overseas, that kind of thing, that there's not necessarily the same idea of a workplace floor anymore. And it becomes harder and harder to organize. So whatever unions do exist, a lot of the times their current idea, their current focus is around how to maintain the power that they do have rather than organizing the unorganized. But we currently in tenant organizing, we're still in that preliminary stage to be able to have the breadth and freedom to be able to define those parameters without that government intervention.
Mm-hmm. And there's also room for mutual solidarity there. So the nature of the struggle that we are in, the tenant organizing, it makes the labor movement a natural and a necessary ally as well. So building a working class movement, which is based on the collective power to be able to bargain and win gains for ourselves, is the basic principle which is connecting us to labor. So that remains. And we see the differences, and we see that we have the tenant organizing, we see it as a part of the labor movement, even though the labor movement may have, with the concessions from the government because of the labor organizing. So similarly, the working class movement in Canada, tenant organizing is a part of it. And these struggles can mutually reinforce each other too. So we see the unions in Canada with thousands of workers, they have the potential to support organizing in neighborhoods. And as also our homes have become the site of struggle as well. So it is important to recognize that the tenant unions can also support the labor unions in building that community support for their bargaining efforts. So there can be mutual support at the workplace, but also where we live, right? So, for example, the BBT, the bank block tenants, they received critical financial support from locals and regional union committees. These funds are so crucial for supporting tenants materially. So in BBT's case, to be able to afford lawyers against landlords and big law. And if you want to see successful organizing in our city, the labor movement can play that important role through material and hopefully political support as well.
Absolutely. It can help politicize people as well, right? I met union workers or tenant quite often realizing your power through connecting with your neighbors and having a villain of sorts that you band against. It creates an awakening. It's a class consciousness naturally emerges without literature, perhaps, that always helps, but it just kind of seems to happen naturally when people especially get to see a victory. So encouraging the work of somebody already there pushing up against a landlord, it's great to see that the locals recognize that value, right? Could you only imagine if the city of Ottawa could see a victory from the tenants union there? It's not like it's been without. Can you report on any victories from tenants in Ottawa?
There's definitely victories, not in the same way because our odds are stacked against, laws and big landlords. But there are moments where you see basically things would have happened much faster. Evictions would have gone on much faster. The compensations, like landlords would be getting away with much more and in much lesser time if the tenants were not organized. Even looking at the bank block tenants, like they've been able to organize against their landlord smart living properties that their own employees have also in some cases left the organization, or you can see the community support that is rising around to push back, exposing investors in their land, people who are doctors in the neighborhood who are invested in these with these landlords which are evicting people. So victory is also in different steps, like step by step. We are seeing it every step of the way, that even gaining for example, what I spoke about, the labor movement supporting it, more and more people getting involved. I would count that as like a big win for tenants as we go along. As Ethan mentioned, like we've seen an incredible amount of support from people. So for the bank block tenants have been an inspiration for many, week by week, day by day, being present in the community. We are meeting people passing by, doing their groceries on the weekend, walking their dogs, stopping to see the tenants and us on the sidewalk and talking to us. And we see that people are interested and they want to know more. But what is important about this interaction is that it's not just a support from the outside. People are sharing their own experiences of renovictions and demovictions, and you hear about the landlords neglecting their homes, the lack of repairs and maintenance, constant threat of eviction looming over all our heads. And then we learn about landlord tactics. So to evict tenants before even reaching the landlord and tenant board. And we can go more and more into this, but I feel like this is a time where, because some people have these tenants are leading the struggle and have organized themselves and are opposing some very powerful people in the city, people are feeling more empowered to come out and not only in support, but also organizing themselves and their buildings. So I would count that as a win, I think, starting that process.
I would agree in the sense that, we are quite new, but one of the things that we have constantly seen is through being organized, we are seeing tenants recognizing themselves as political actors. And so it's not just about, understanding their rights or feeling empowered to enforce their rights, but even going so far as to demand more, and to see themselves as having a role to play in the sort of society that they want to live in for themselves and for future generations.
Oh, that's just music probably to everybody's ears who's hearing that, because that is half the struggle, if not more. Obviously, you can't quantify people realizing that they deserve more and that they absolutely have the power within them to get it, if organized. And that doesn't just mean, teaming up with your neighbors. That is the first step in tenant organizing, meeting your neighbors and finding common ground. But if we could talk about making these connections and how you folks, you talk about a lot of door knocking, we'd call that deep canvassing, right? And that seems to be how you're reaching a lot of people. You also have weekly meetings where you're finding new tenant groups or potential new tenant unions popping up. I told you that I just kind of put a TikTok up about tenant organizing, and a friend mentioned, oh yeah, last year my building was organized into a union, just like really nonchalantly. And I'm going, how many are there out there? And if there's so many out there, we need to get them connected. We need to get them organized amongst themselves, right, to create that massive power. So if you folks can hit on the things that you do that, would kind of qualify as organizing, because I think sometimes when we say it, people don't know sometimes what that means, what that means for your time. What are you actually doing to support the bank block tenants and grow networks of tenants?
Since last summer, I suppose, we've been working on building community support for the bank block tenants in their struggle. That process has been led by the bank block tenants as an organization, and our role is to work as supporters based on what they tell us they need from us to try to build that community support. And what that looks like concretely is, as we alluded to before, a lot of door knocking. So when they have calls to action, or if they have stuff they want to put out, we share it on social media, but we go door knocking, often with members of the bank block tenants, to directly talk to others in the buildings around them in the neighborhood about what's going on Bank Street, and asking folks if they know about it, if they're interested in supporting, sharing the action items with them. But as part of that process, also asking them about the situation in their building. And we've found that more and more, it seems like almost every building we're in has some kind of serious issue, whether it's an above guideline rent increase, whether it's maintenance issues. There are so many renovictions and demevictions happening in central Ottawa, roughly speaking, right now. Almost everyone we talk to can relate immediately to what's happening on Bank Street. So, and as part of having those conversations, in addition to sharing the info from bank block tenants, we also try to provide a way for those people to get involved by coming out door knocking with us maybe in the future, or coming out to meetings. But we also support them if they have things in their building that they need, even if it's as simple as putting together a survey or delivering a letter. We can support them in doing that. So it's just a lot of face-to-face interaction, connecting with people, seeing what they need, and building the capacity to support them. And now we're at a point where, since we've spoken to so many people, and we've learned a lot through building the People's Assembly. We're trying to create a space where tenants in those other buildings can relate to one another and to struggles like those on Bank Block. Because we've seen the number one thing that people ask if we talk to them about getting organized is, has this ever happened before? Or they ask, has anyone ever managed to fight something like this? Has anyone ever won? Like the same question you were just asking. And there are examples locally too, at Osgood Chambers and Manor Village, for example, where tenants have been able to successfully resist eviction attempts. So just being able to, when we talk to people, putting them in touch with the Bank Block tenants and showing them what's going on, sometimes one block down the street from them, can really open the doors for what's possible in their building. And that's a lot of what that community support building work looks like concretely.
These landlords and law firms, and they rely on the isolation and alienation of tenants as well. And in a lot of these cases, you will see that because of the lack of support, because of the lack of awareness, and awareness is not everything. However, it is key to know that you can fight this. And when they see that other people are also organizing, we have actually seen in how even a little bit of just connecting from one tenant to the other can lead to them deciding to take action and then leading that. So the landlords are organized among themselves. They are well organized with their common lawyers, with their team of people, with their team of property managers and strategies. So on our end, combining our efforts just makes sense. With tenant organizing happening all across Canada, and like a big shout out to Vancouver Tenants Union, who we have worked in solidarity with, extended our solidarity to them, and they have extended solidarity to us as well. So one of their landlords or investors and one of their owners of their buildings was in Ottawa recently speaking at a public event and talking about different issues, but completely ignoring the fact that they're actively evicting people in Vancouver. So people in Ottawa have disrupted their events, have spoken to them and asked them the tough questions in Ottawa that why are you evicting people? How are you comfortable evicting people in Vancouver? And what do you have to say about that? With no answers. Similarly, Toronto tenants, Thorncliffe tenants recently drove 6 hours to Ottawa and attended and confronted the PSP Investments, their public event, where they were reporting to their decision makers and also the people whose funds they manage. And these tenants confronted them, Thorncliffe tenants here in Ottawa, and asked them the questions like, what do you have to say for increasing rent above guidelines and evicting thousands of tenants? Complete silence in the room, not a word. So they cannot even look the tenants that they are evicting in their eyes and have a response. Nothing.
I love how they fly across the country or halfway across the country, some of them, and just to be faced with the issues they thought they left behind, and how heartwarming they must have felt as being those tenant unions and seeing folks act in solidarity all that way away, just haunting these investors wherever they go.
Absolutely. I don't think they should be at peace and remove themselves from the tenants who they are actively evicting. So
make landlords afraid again. And Toronto has experienced a few victories of its own with tenant unions, even at the landlord-tenant board, which would surprise a lot of people. You can tell the people you talk to, they have gone on rent strike and won. There's another set of tenants that just the other day were able to come to an amicable agreement with their landlord after being on rent strike for a very, very long time. And no wonder people feel like that. I don't think some people will realize, especially if they've been listening, because we know about tenant rights, but there are people who will simply get an eviction, not notice, like not an N13. They'll get their landlord telling them to get out. and they have no idea if they have any rights at all. Like, they are just scrambling to find a new place to live. So for those people to then discover what a possible alternative is, that must be mind-blowing at first and come with a lot of skepticism, right? I imagine that folks are worried about getting in trouble going up against their landlord in the same way that you would get in a workplace hesitation to unionize, as to not stir the pot. So yeah, finding more and more examples to provide people is critical. That's how all, revolutions begin. Typically is also by learning from previous ones, right? Seeing previous victories and knowing it is something that's achievable.
If we think back to the course of the past half century and we see a decimation of social supports, government services, wages not keeping up with inflation, and even those who might be afforded social supports, there are constant surveillance, the government constantly threatening to yank these supports away at a moment's notice. This lack of a social safety net ends up performing this disciplinary force over the working class, so that working class people, become concerned with maintaining what little scraps the government provides them, rather than feeling empowered to enforce any rights that the government tells them that they have, let alone even demanding more. And so we see this constantly with door knocking, with talking to tenants, is they're constantly in a situation where they feel they don't want a target to be put on their back for enforcing rights. They don't want to become a problem. So, as you said, when a landlord tells them you have to leave, or even if they are given an N13 notice, which the Landlord-Tenant Board doesn't even have access to, it's just the preliminary notice, they might immediately read that and think, oh, I have 2 or 3 months to leave, I'm just going to leave. And no matter how many times an individual is told, oh, you don't necessarily have to leave right now, you can have a hearing in 8 or 9 months or whatever the time period is, to be able to possibly get your apartment back. Tenants oftentimes just think it's not worth the trouble. It's not worth the stress of thinking, oh, I might be thrown on the street. So it's just this intense power imbalance that has had this civilizing effect over the course of the past half century or so. And it's only through this collective power for people to be able to turn to their neighbors and say, as an individual, we might have this power, but together, we have 100 times as much power. That's where we see an ability to be able for tenants to successfully organize and fight against the immense power of these landlords.
You used civilizing with such disdain. Like, I've never heard anybody use that word in a negative way. I know we all understand the issues with that word and Western civilization, but like, she didn't miss a beat, it's had this civilizing effect, that we wish we could undo. And it's just, sorry, that was such a moment for me, because I was like, she knows where we're at. Right? she gets it. Ethan, I'm sorry. What were you going to say, brother?
Oh, no problem. No, I was just going to say, I think that the point that Seema was making connects to, I think, another point that she's made many times in our organizing, which is the importance of being proactive. And that's something that as the NOC, that's one of our focuses, is not just waiting until there is a critical issue, not just waiting until there is an eviction to organize in a building, but to create tenant committees and structures in buildings well before that happens. Because we've seen landlords try to use every trick imaginable to get tenants out of the building, whether it's directly threatening them, whether it's trying to trick them into voluntarily terminating their own tenancy. There's really no low that they won't stoop to. So I think it speaks to the importance of having people organized even before that point, so that when something comes up, people know what their rights are, but they're also already in touch with their neighbors. They don't feel as isolated. They can discuss it collectively. And going forward, that's one of the things that we're really trying to do, is develop those structures in buildings and blocks, getting neighbors talking to one another well before a building has been issued with eviction notices or a similar critical crisis point has been reached.
We've heard from York Southwest tenant unions that immediately after the ruling in their favor from the landlord-tenant board, the attitude of the landlord changed. The interactions with property management became, shall we say, civilized. And it was the repercussions of tenant organizing that started to mitigate some of the predatory behaviors of the landlord. Do you think we're reaching a level of tenant organizing where landlords will have to change tack? They will still be looking to maximize profit, but they, I think, will need to adapt their tactics, because this isolation that you say that they rely on, which is absolutely true, you and other people doing this good work are eroding that. And they can't use the normal manipulation tactics, and the power imbalance is also being eroded, right, with the people power you're building. So can you imagine how landlords are going to respond?
Should I say our goal is to make housing not profitable again?
Abolish landlords, is that the new hashtag? Yeah, I mean, that is the ultimate goal. Until we get there, though, it'd be nice to know that they at least make it known to them that we're here to keep them in check, in the same way bosses of unionized workplaces understand their limitations. Because a lot of landlords don't take unions seriously. Are you finding that? I mean, obviously, because you've been dealing with Bank Block, one of their main gripes was, the landlord refused to even talk to them collectively, recognize them collectively. Now, the landlord-tenant board did recognize the tenants in Toronto collectively, because the landlord tried to take them to the board for their rent strike. And they said, okay, well, we're also going to bring our complaints at the same time collectively. And that was a huge win. I mean, that's what ensured that they were able to, I think, gain the upper hand there. Can you speak to that at all, in just trying to find ways to get landlords to understand this absolutely is a serious thing that you are going to have to deal with as a collective?
Like you said, whatever that big win may look like, and of course, we want to end the commodification of housing, right? Like that's the ultimate goal. We look at them as investors, not as not the rebranding that they're attempting to do with like, oh, they're small landlords, big landlords. At the end of the day, the commodification itself, supported by policies and government laws and policies and infrastructure, is at the root cause of this. That goal in mind, but on an everyday level, like the immediate demands that Ethan was talking about, in the case of bank block tenants, they have been consistently from day one saying, you will, like, we are a collective. Like, you will talk to bank block tenants. That's what they're saying to the landlords. And as we have seen, there was a rally recently that it's almost like movie like villain. Like they would shut their drapes on us as we are standing outside their offices, and the tenants are standing outside saying, you said you want to talk to us. Here we are with 40 and 50 other people. Like, let's talk. And the property managers are shutting their drapes, closing in as if we are, I don't know what they're closing the doors on us and hiding inside, trying to enter from the back doors to their own offices. The extent that they would go to avoid talking to tenants is just crazy. They also, one of the tactics that they've used, as an example of when landlords are forced to change their tactics or scramble in the face of this collective power, is the rebranding that they keep doing. So smart living properties they own, whose names and faces people in our community know that you are the owner of smart living properties, they will go ahead and change their name to something else and rebrand completely, and then show up again in your neighborhood. So that's an example of what they try to do. That they're in a corner, they're cornered, and so they come up with new tactics. But they're not fooling anybody. People realize in the neighborhood that we are talking to each other, and when these changes happen, and it's you cannot do that in isolation anymore. You cannot have a hearing expecting the tenant to not show up, because if they are talking to other tenants, they know that showing up is important. So things like that. I think is one of the examples that I could think of, that how the landlords also are now coming up with new tactics is because they're forced to. And any victory in labor history or any other people working class victory is because they were forced to change that. So this collective power, it's not going to be asked nicely and they are going to give these concessions. I think this building of collective power is absolutely necessary, and is showing, I think, results.
I was just thinking of another example of a tactic that landlords have taken now. What is that now they're filing defamation claims against tenants and tenant unions, and that's happening in Toronto and in Vancouver, to get to use their resources, their whole host of lawyers, to file these bogus defamation claims in the hope of instilling fear in these groups, so that they have to second guess the sorts of posters and information that they're distributing in public, so that they have to second guess communications that they're having amongst each other. So it ends up having this, their intention is to have this sort of chilling effect on the organizing of tenants.
Those have to be slap suits. Hopefully a court sees those for what they are. Those are, and Ontario does have protections for that. But that's when, those material supports that you're talking about that not everybody can provide, but locals can, and some people can, but for the legal fees, the unnecessary legal fees. Some people might not understand just how extensive it gets, but those are really classic tactics, I think, of capital. Right? We've seen corporations use those tactics. I'll tell you, the NDP employed similar tactics. Their main focus was keeping ridings from talking to one another, right? So that you couldn't share gripes or experiences with abuses of power. And it's all part of that civilization, that civilizing, diminishing of power, right? And the second guessing is when you're asking people to just forge ahead and take risks. That's really tricky when it just gets thicker and thicker, with lawsuits that they wouldn't expect. I don't imagine it worked though. Hopefully that just makes people more angry.
Like we shouldn't succumb to the legal avenues because they've never worked for tenants in the first place.
Landlord and tenant board and these other legal avenues, they are not designed to be giving or providing justice in this context. The Tenancies Act, it treats landlord and tenants like landlords as service providers, and then the tenants that are receiving these services. That's how the treatment is. And if they're simply applying the law, but the law in itself is not created or designed to see this as an exploitative relationship in the first place. So there is lack of recognition or development of the law at this point that sees this inherently as an exploitative relationship at the landlord and tenant board stage. So if they don't recognize that, the adjudicators have no responsibility and legal obligation. They have, through the law, they can, right? But that needs to develop over time, and that's what the struggle hopefully will also go. But organizing is primary, because right now, without that, they will not be compelled to. These facts that are being brought to the adjudicators, they have the ability, but they can only do that once they are forced to face the facts, which is how the tenants have organized themselves, and also making those arguments in and of itself. So that work has to come. The second point I also wanted to say is this movement will require everybody. So yes, we need the legal fees and we need the support and allyship and political and material support of the labor movement, but also lawyers and people who want to get involved, using those skills to help the tenants as well, not for profit, not to profit off these services as well, because at the end of the day, these are absolutely critical services that the movement needs as well. So there's different roles to fill, and I think more people getting involved and getting involved in those parts as well is necessary, but not the most important thing, because without organizing, there are massive limitations.
What's the number one need that you folks have right now, whether it be material or logistical? If you could wave a magic wand and we could get you one thing.
Oh, there's not one thing, but I think others can speak to that better. But I will say one thing that, yes, definitely, I think material support is necessary. So financial support for lawyers, yes. But secondly, I think what's important is like come out, like get out in person, come out for the door knocking, come out, meet us at the tables, and increase the strength as we meet out, for example, on Saturdays or any other weekly meetings, to come out and then go out door knocking with us, get involved, become tenant reps in your buildings and organize your building, talk to your neighbors. And that just cannot happen alone in an isolation. So come out, meet us in person, and reach out to us so that we can get involved and think of concrete ways how people can start supporting tenants. Because this is, at the end of the day, not aid work. This is not charity. And housing is not just a topical hot issue or strictly an academic issue, even though there's like great work happening to study and expose systemic issues. And while that is important, and policies and laws change, when the ruling class is forced to change them. So when I say that this isn't charity, then what it is, it's actually a group of tenants who are getting organized. So if you are a tenant and this directly applies to you, it's your interests are advanced through working with tenants, then working people in the city need to come out and strengthen it and also learn how to organize our own buildings and neighborhoods.
I mean, deep canvassing and door knocking, I think, is something that is undervalued. I mean, grassroots organizations understand its value, but for those who've only canvassed politically, you're typically taught, go to the door, knock on it, find out if you've got the right person and who they're going to vote for, and move on to the next one. It's so when you say door knocking, you really mean go talk to your community members, or listen rather to your community members. Do you want to speak to the difference between those two types of door knocking just a little bit?
No, for sure. I think that gets to a key point, which is maybe in the case of what people are familiar with from electoral politics, would be a kind of canvassing that sees people as passive. You go door to door to identify who people are voting for, to collect data, but it's not so much geared at encouraging those people to take action beyond maybe just voting. So what we're talking about is instead seeing people that we speak to as potentially active in the process of organizing. And that can be at a number of levels. That can be just by encouraging them to come out if they're not at a stage where they're ready to organize in their building, encouraging them to come out in support of other tenants like the bank block tenants. But it can also be if people identify that they have issues in their building and they're interested, instead of us telling them exactly what to do or us coming in and doing it for them, our goal is then to work with that person and be a strong supporter for them in taking action for themselves with their neighbors in their building. So every tenant that we talk to, we see as a potential organizer as well, not just somebody who we are going to organize and mobilize and do things for. And in so many ways, I think this approach can be more effective too, in the sense that it'll allow them to build power in their buildings, but also I think a network of people in buildings who are in touch with their neighbors and who are able to work with their neighbors to, whether it's bringing them out for a demonstration or whether it's organizing a more direct action. That's something has an incredible amount of potential power in it. So I think the distinction is whether when we're going door knocking, we see people as data points or as passive contacts to be mobilized. Yeah, exactly. Or if we see them as potential organizers who, can play a leading role in the struggle as well.
Before we started recording, you folks were talking about something you've got brewing. I mean, the idea of getting tenants connected with one another must just scare the shit out of landlords. I mean, you should jokingly invite them to this just so they know just at what level you folks are talking to one another. Because I think that could have a chilling effect on even those mom and pop landlords that we're really supposed to feel bad about when we're shit talking landlords. But what do you folks have up your sleeve that you can leave the audience with?
So just since I teased it, I guess I might start. So the Neighborhood Organizing Center, although we've been organizing for a while, us doing it under that name is relatively new. So we are encouraging people, if you are interested in doing this kind of work of supporting tenant organizing and helping build the capacity for tenants to get organized, please reach out to us. There are a lot of folks in the community who have different levels of different kinds of time on their hands, different capacities, and there's room for people to be involved at whatever level works for them. At the same time, the NOC, the Neighborhood Organizing Center, is convening the People's Assembly, which is that wider forum for participation. And as mentioned, we're hoping that will be the product of deeper organizing, where tenants are attending as representatives of our buildings, and that can be a space where tenant committees and tenant unions can thrive and can help support tenants in getting that started in their buildings. So if that interests you, in January, on January 18th, we're going to be doing a workshop, which has a more educational focus on tenant organizing. And then for the first meeting of the People's Assembly in this new forum, it will be in February of 2025.
And we, in our own work, will continue to learn from other tenants and tenant unions and tenants as well, which I think this podcast also talks a lot about, but that's sort of the way forward. And connecting our different movements and different struggle is also a key part, but that can be a whole other episode too. So gonna not talk about that right now.
That is like the whole podcast, social movements, labor movements, tenant movements. How can we get them all going in the same direction at the same time? And can we imagine what that would look like if we could? Definitely.
Even if you're not based in Ottawa and you're organizing across Canada, we would still be interested in hearing from you. As has been mentioned previously, this is a struggle across the country for tenants and for the working class more broadly.
Yes, I wish we were recording when I asked Ethan, is this your sole focus, tenant organizing? And he said, well, right now it is. And I said, oh, had you done something previous? And it was like, no, just this is where we're starting, people. This is just the beginning, the seed of the potential that people could hold, right? Ethan, did I represent you well enough there?
Absolutely, yeah. So like Seema said, we see this, the tenant struggle is not an isolated thing. It's not cut off from the rest of society, but it's a part of the larger system that we're living in. And the way that the housing system is exploitative is the way that capitalism is exploitative. And the way that working class tenants can get organized for power is the way that the working class can get organized for power. So we see it as part of that larger movement and larger struggle. And that's why we're very thrilled to be on a platform like this. I will just say one more thing, just because I was thinking about it earlier. Landlords really, their whole business model is based on inflicting violence on people, on tenants, which they are completely removed from. So they can force people out of their homes onto the street. They can force people to live in horrible conditions while they live in mansions, and they never have to deal with it. So I think with 2025, I know Toronto's a bit ahead of where we are in Ottawa, but we're going to show them that they can't get away with it anymore, that you can't inflict this kind of violence on people and expect to just wash your hands of it and live comfortably in your home. It's just not gonna, that era has passed.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.